it Prophecies from the Exodus. I think for a long time we have believed, rightfully so, that we have to be delivered out of Egypt as well. So it wouldn't be surprising that there would be indicators in the Exodus from Egypt that Israel made that will show experiences that we will go through as well. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Seventh-day Adventists are believing that we're going to get out of this world without much trouble. And that God is just going to, kind of take good care of us, and we'll go on from here into our heavenly home. But that shows a lack of understanding about this story as well as our own condition. So we're going to be looking at especially the points that show what are some of the things ahead of us. In Exodus chapter 5, verse 2, we find the attitude of the king. And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." So, for a number of years, not 400 years like some people believe, but for a number of years, they were in slavery. It couldn't have been too terrible because a lot of them would have liked to have stayed in Egypt until Moses came. Then they didn't want to stay there anymore. But previous to Moses coming, many of them were satisfied to stay in Egypt. And things have been getting rougher in this country for us for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into. But it is way worse for people of other countries. They are really suffering. Many of them don't have enough food. They can't get a job. I hear many, calls for help from other countries. They get connected with me over LinkedIn and tell me what they're experiencing, and it's pretty rough. It's as bad as being slaves. And yet, in spite of all that, we're going to find out some things about ourselves maybe as we go through this story. But the reason they couldn't get out quickly was this king. And we know in the end of time, it's going to be packaged in a package of Christianity. That is, the control is going to come from something that's packaged as a Christian entity. But we know from Revelation, it's going to be a mixture of spiritualism in that. And that's what Pharaoh, he was a spiritualist, actually. We'd call him a heathen, but notice Great Controversy 588 says that spiritualism more closely imitates the nominal Christianity of the day. It has greater power to deceive and ensnare. So spiritualism for a long time has been moving in to the churches, both Protestant and Catholic. And it was in the other religions long ago. So spiritualism has been moving in. So what is Satan going to do? Satan himself is converted after the modern order of things. So the churches get to the point where Satan can be a member of their church. He's really the leader of their church. Satan himself is converted after the modern order of things. He will appear in the character of an angel of light. And it's possible that he might arrive, if you've been watching some of the news, in a UFO, or now they call them a UAF, or UAP, I guess. That's what they call them. But there's a lot more of them happening, and people are all getting excited. They're starting to think that we're going to be visited from aliens from other countries. But there's only two groups of people in the world, in the universe, and that's God and his followers and Satan and his followers. So there's no other aliens to come here other than those two groups. But people, they don't realize that. Now, one of the first things that they had to face in this getting out of Egypt was about the Sabbath. And I didn't put in the sermon all the details, but I'll share them. Over the years, the reason it was becoming more comfortable for them in Egypt is that most of them quit keeping the Sabbath. And, in general, Adventists are doing some quitting of the Sabbath, or at least not going to church. It's increased quite a bit since COVID came along. That people just stopped going to church. They may watch it online, but they stopped going to church. It's not the same to watch it online. If you don't have any choice, that's better than nothing. But it's really to get the full benefit, we've got to meet together. And so a lot of them had quit keeping the Sabbath, and that made the Egyptians like them more. And so when Moses came back, he said, you can't expect God to deliver you if you're not keeping the Sabbath. And he convinced them that they needed to keep the Sabbath. So they started keeping the Sabbath. So here, that's background to Exodus 5, verses 4 and 5. And the king of Egypt said unto them, wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, which is an old word that means hinder. Moses and Aaron, why are you hindering the people from their works? Well, he didn't hinder them 6 days a week. It was only the Sabbath that he was hindering them from working. Ye make them rest from their burdens. Now that word that's used, translated rest, is the same word used in Genesis 3, talking about what we need to do on Sabbath. Rest. Notice here, Patriarchs and Prophets 2:58, the Sabbath had been generally disregarded. Most people were not paying attention to the Sabbath. Why? Because if they did, their persecution would be worse. So they gave it up. Now, many Seventh-day Adventists haven't given up the Sabbath, but I am not convinced that the way that a lot of people keep the Sabbath will be acceptable to God. And so maybe we didn't go as far as they did, but if we keep the Sabbath the way it ought to be, we may have more trouble. So it says, the Sabbath had been generally disregarded, and the exactions of their taskmasters made its observance apparently impossible. So they realized if we really keep the Sabbath, we won't be able to stay alive or make a living or whatever they were worried about. Now, in this country, we're so blessed, we don't realize what it's like in the rest of the world. Although it's getting harder to keep a job and to keep the Sabbath. And it's going to get worse on that issue of having a job and still being able to keep the Sabbath. But in many countries, they work on Sabbath if their employer asks them to, because if they don't, they lose their job and they don't know where else they would get a job. So this is why God left this story to try to help us recognize that, sure, you will have trouble if you keep the Sabbath, but if we want to be delivered out of this world, we're going to have to be willing to go through whatever trouble we have to go through to be able to keep the Sabbath. But Moses had shown his people that obedience to God was the first condition of deliverance. So if we want to be delivered out of this world to the heavenly Canaan, Sabbath keeping is the first step. We need to practice proper Sabbath keeping, which means a lot of things, which I won't mention all of them, but it means that we keep the whole day, not just while we're in Sabbath school and church. And it means going to Sabbath school, not just church. Unless you're too far away, you just can't make it, I understand. But for Adventists, the Adventist churches are mostly empty for Sabbath school. And so God is calling. If we want to be delivered out of this world, we need to practice Sabbath the way He asked us to do it. And then the rest of the day is not to do what we please, but it is a spiritual day all day long, either to benefit our own spirituality or to help somebody else's spirituality. That's the way the Sabbath is to be kept. And it must be kept that way if we want to be delivered. So Moses said, you've got to keep the Sabbath. But as a result, trouble descended upon them. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:59. During all the years of servitude in Egypt, there had been among the Israelites some who adhered to the worship of Jehovah. They did not conceal their faith. Well, what happened when they didn't conceal their faith? But the Egyptians disdained to be instructed by their slaves. They tried to seduce the worshipers of God by promises of reward. And this failing, by threats and cruelty. So this is a group of people that said, we don't care, we're going to keep the Sabbath. And they not only kept the Sabbath, but they tried to teach their Egyptian taskmasters and others around them. They tried to teach them about the Sabbath. And as a result, they got into trouble fast. And first, they were tried to be bought off, offered rewards if they would stop keeping the Sabbath. But when they wouldn't do that, then they threatened them. And if they still didn't listen, they experienced cruelty that was the result of Sabbath keeping. Now, we haven't experienced all of that. I mean, there might have been some that did in this country, but those things are going to be on the increase. And some of them have already existed, and they're going to increase as time goes forward. And so we must value the Sabbath in such a way that we would rather die than to give up the Sabbath. If it's not that issue with us, then we won't hang in there through what's ahead. And this, looking at it from the prophecy side, this experience that they had is a prophecy of what's going to happen, not just in the world, but even in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the end of time. And so God gives a special call to his people. It's time to be delivered. And if you want to be delivered, you need to return to the Sabbath keeping that I asked you to follow if you want to be delivered. And so it's a definite call for Seventh-day Adventists right now. Now, I listened to a video on the way down. I couldn't look at it. But it's in regard to a plan. Now, when people make plans, we never know whether God will disrupt that plan or not. But in view of what's happened already, I will be surprised if this one gets hindered. But a plan has been made, and it's in print so people can read it. They're not trying to hide it. It's called something 2025. Project 2025. And, you know, if you never heard the quotation or never heard about this, it's time you paid attention, because we're not supposed to vote for who's the president. Because when that president goes in, if you voted for him, you're responsible for what he does. So we can't vote for Democrat or Republican or Independent. But anyway, the Republicans are really exercised by the kind of government that we've had for the last 3 years and will have for another year. And so they want to really change things. And one of the things they want to change is to have a Sunday law. Where, now it's a very mild one in the way it's worded, but we know what happens once it gets started. And so it's something that will be pushed immediately if they win the election. So we're facing this Sabbath issue even more than we've ever faced it before. Going back to Pharaoh, here's what he decided to do in Exodus 5, 6 through 8. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, Ye shall no more give the people straw to make brick, as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tale of the bricks which they did make heretofore, ye shall lay upon them. I don't know whether you've thought about the fact that the very first Sunday law that prohibits work on Sunday is going to make it much harder for Seventh-day Adventists to survive. Because now we have Sunday to do the work around the house and other things that we want to do. But when you don't have Sunday and you can't work on Sabbath, things will get harder. And that's only the beginning. So Pharaoh decides, I'm going to make it so hard for them that they have to break the Sabbath. And those tactics, that's a prophecy of what is going to happen to us as we get out of the Egypt of today. Now, when Moses first came back and informed the people of Israel that God had called him to take them out of Egypt, you can just imagine what they were thinking. He's going to come in here. He's going to, in just a short time, he's going to get us out of here, and we're going to be on our way. I'm afraid many Adventists think the same thing today. But it's not going to be like that. Here's what they had to go through. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:59. The sufferings of the people had been much increased. So this rule that you've got to collect the straw and make just as many bricks as you used to make increased their suffering. It was bad enough before. All over the land, a cry of despair went up from old and young, and all united in charging upon him, that's Moses, the disastrous change in their condition. So they got angry at Moses. They were happy before, but when this happened, they were unhappy. And I suppose the people that teach the Adventist people about the way we should live if we want to get out of this old world are going to be attacked also when we're getting delivered out of Egypt. Also on page 260, but those who were true to God understood that it was because of Israel's departure from him, because of their disposition to marry with heathen nations, thus being led into idolatry, that the Lord had permitted them to become bondmen. So if we haven't either been faithful because we knew what we ought to do, or we didn't learn everything about how to be faithful to God, he can't deliver quickly because we are too attached to too many things. And so he has to let us have it rough for a while. God didn't, really want them to have it rough, but it was because of their condition spiritually that it was necessary to let them have it really rough. Page 268 says, his people were permitted to experience the grinding cruelty of the Egyptians, that they might not be deceived concerning the debasing influence of idolatry. See, every time that we do different than what God told us, we are in idolatry. And so there's some idols we don't like and we don't want to follow, but most of us have some idols we like. And so in order for us to be delivered out, he has to allow us to have it really rough so that we really do want to get out of here. And we're not attached to anything down here. We're happy to get out. In his dealing with Pharaoh, the Lord manifested his hatred of idolatry. So those plagues hit most of the idols. They had so many, they probably didn't hit them all, but it hit many of the idols that they worshiped to show not only Pharaoh but Israel, don't follow their gods. It's not worth doing that. And his determination to punish cruelty and oppression. You know, there's a tendency when somebody gets in charge that they're too hard on other people. I've seen it happen over and over again, and especially if they're really young. They really want to shape up people fast and to have penalties and so on to make sure they do what they ought to do. So there's something of this in all of us. Hopefully we don't have it as bad as Pharaoh. But God was demonstrating, don't be cruel, don't be oppressive. This is not the character of God. He's not like that. And he wanted them to learn so when they got on their own, they wouldn't do that. And also the Egyptians had to learn as well. Here's a really big one. The Hebrews had expected to obtain their freedom without any special trial of their faith or any real suffering or hardship. That's what they thought. So they weren't prepared. Now, we have a little bit of knowledge, I believe, about what it may be like, but probably not a real clear understanding. And I think that's why the story has been put in the Bible, and it takes up quite a few chapters. And in Patriarchs and Prophets, it takes up quite a few chapters because it's trying to help us understand some of the details of what we may go through. This is from page 260. But they were not yet prepared for deliverance. Now, if God asked us, are you ready for deliverance? We'd probably say yes. I hear Adventists here and there say, I just can't wait to get out of this world. Well, that's good, but you better be prepared for what you go through before you get out. They had little faith in God and were unwilling patiently, that's a key word, patiently to endure their afflictions until he should see fit to work for them. Maybe one of the ways he prepares us is sickness. Do you get impatient when you're sick and you're not being healed within a few hours? You know, that develops our patience. God is able to deliver us, but to train us and to help us, he often delays, and that's what he did for them. They suffered more, and they suffered for longer than what they wanted to do and what they believed they should have to do even. And if somebody, when they go through that, starts blaming God and decides to give up, they'll never get translated out of this world. Because we have to be willing to endure to the end, whatever it is that we have to go through. Until he should see fit to work for them. So we have to suffer until he says, you don't have to suffer anymore. Many were content to remain in bondage rather than meet the difficulties attending removal to a strange land. So, we think that slavery was really bad, But it may have been more like the employer-employee relationship that we have today. It could have been a little more vigorous than that. But, until Pharaoh got worried that they were getting too big, it might not have been all that bad. And then what he did was to kill the babies to try to take care of it, rather than maybe oppressive measures. It wasn't until Moses came along and said, "You must keep the Sabbath," that things got really bad. So let's say that they were given a choice. Do you want to leave Egypt? This is before the Sabbath issue. Do you want to leave Egypt or do you want to stay here? A bunch of them would have said, we'd rather stay here. So God had to get them to really want to get out. And that's a prophecy of what God's going to have to do so that we don't just say it in words, we want to get out, but where we really want to get out of this old world. Many were content to remain in bondage rather than meet the difficulties attending removal to a strange land. And the habits of some had become so much like those of the Egyptians that they preferred to dwell in Egypt. Wow. This is also on page 260. Therefore, the Lord did not deliver them by the first manifestation of his power before Pharaoh. That's where the rods were thrown down and it turned into a snake. He didn't deliver them with that first one. And not only did he not deliver them with that first display of God's power, but they suffered the first 3 plagues just like the Egyptians. Besides the oppressive attitude of the king. So things were really rough for them. He overruled events more fully to develop the tyrannical spirit of the Egyptian king and also to reveal himself to his people. So he had two purposes in mind for allowing things to get really rough for them. Number one, that they really wanted to get out. That this old world, at least the Egyptian world, didn't hold any desire of theirs anymore. They wanted to get out. And it was also so that they would see how much power God has. And they would trust him more, which was going to take a lot of that trust for them to get over to the land of Canaan. In chapter 7 of Exodus, verses 11 and 12, "And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt, cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods." So they weren't real snakes, but they looked like snakes. This has the appearance of a miracle. It wasn't a full miracle because they didn't have life. And they saw that, but it didn't really change their mind. Patriarchs and Prophets 264 says there was nothing in their appearance to distinguish them from the serpent produced by Moses. We are going to be confronted with miracles. what looks like miracles. In fact, we already have been. There have been many things that look like miracles. And often they test the faith. But we're going to be facing more and more of that as we go forward from now. Because Satan is going to enable his servants to look like they're able to heal people. With Satan, what he does is makes them sick and then he heals them. But since he's the one that made them sick, he can heal them. And then there are apparent miracles. Like I heard of a story where this woman was crippled and she had to walk with crutches. And she came up to the faith healer, and the faith healer told her, "You're healed, you can drop those crutches right there." And she walked off the stage, and it looked like she was totally healed. But later, a Seventh-day Adventist was studying the Bible with her, and she started having a question about whether she was really healed or not. And so this Adventist told her, "If you want to know, pray that if this wasn't from God, that you'll become crippled again." Would you be willing to do that if you'd been free of crutches? Well, she did it, and she had to go back on crutches because she wasn't actually healed. These things are going to test, and if our faith is not strong enough, we're not going to stay faithful to God. We're going to be tricked. We're going to be fooled. This is a prophecy that, many are going to be fooled by this. Now, we know that the first 3 plagues fell on the Israelites too, which you can imagine made them unhappy. The first 3 were not too good. The water turning to blood and the frogs all over the place. And so, but we know that from Exodus 8:22. God said, "I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there." So from there to the end of the plagues, none of them fell. By that time, they were starting to get a little more encouraged, and we're not told exactly where the oppression was reduced. But in the end of time, we know that at the close of probation, they can't take the life of anybody anymore. So we know that will be a limit. However, when Jesus comes, or when he makes the announcement that he's coming, there will be people in deep seclusion. Talk about, living in tents. You probably won't be able to carry all the stuff there when we have to live out in the wilderness. Or some people will be in prison, and some people will be hiding, we're told, in attics and so on. And so the difficulties won't be over until Jesus actually comes. But he starts to show that he's doing something to be an encouragement to people. And so that's what happened to them, and it will happen to us. Exodus 8:25 and 6, "And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, 'Go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land.' And Moses said, 'Lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes? And will they not stone us?'" Now there's 2 things that I was impressed with here. First of all, there comes into every heathen worship an exaltation of animals and a decreased respect for human life. Animal life is respected higher, and human life is not respected. Can you see it's coming into Christianity, so-called Christianity? And certainly it's coming into the world. Higher respect for animals than for humans. And some people wouldn't even want to go to heaven if their dog or cat or whatever animal they have doesn't go there, which they don't go there. They're not going to go to heaven. He'll give us one much better if we want one. But the Egyptians worshipped animals, and they highly regarded the animals. So Moses said, we better not do that here. We'll get stoned. And Pharaoh knew that, but he was just trying to get the plagues to stop. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:66. Such was the reverence in which these creatures were held, that to slay one, even accidentally, here I'm driving down the highway and I kill an animal, was a crime punishable with death. So their view is like what's building now. I mean, there's some places in the world it's the same as it was back there. But even in this country, it's building this reverence for animals more than what is appropriate. We need to be kind to animals, but not to see them in a higher way than human beings. Exodus 9:16, for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. So Pharaoh had a reason for his existence. It's the same as, letting Hitler or Putin or any of these other, the Chinese leader. All these dictators have been raised up for the same purpose that Pharaoh was raised up. So that God, in the end, could demonstrate his power so clearly that everybody could see that God has mighty power. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:67 and 8. His providence had overruled events to place him upon the throne at the very time appointed for Israel's deliverance. That through his stubbornness, the Lord might manifest his wonders in the land of Egypt. The disposing of events is God's providence. I'm sure they did a lot of complaining about Pharaoh. But now that we have the story, we don't need to complain about any dictators or any harsh measures that are done, because God has a plan. And he is accomplishing the same thing that he did back there in Egypt. And God doesn't let them have control forever. Pharaoh didn't keep control, did he? In fact, in the end, he got annihilated. But God was demonstrating, because of his stubbornness, demonstrating more and more of his power, so that anybody who was willing to recognize the superiority of God would be able to choose. Now, we might already choose to follow God, but there's a lot of other people that haven't made that choice yet. And they have to see it very clearly so that they can make the choice. This is the favorite one out of this story, in my opinion, Exodus 9:29. This is in the plague of the hail. And it wasn't just hail, there was lightning and thunder, and it was a real storm. And Moses said unto him, as soon as I am gone out of the city. So Pharaoh wanted this plague over, and Moses said, okay, as soon as I get outside the city, it'll stop. I will spread abroad my hands unto the Lord, and the thunder shall cease, neither shall there be any more hail. Now, how would you like to be Moses? He's got to walk through the thunder, the lightning, and the hail that's killing animals and people. Any animals or any people that were out there are dead. And he's going to walk through that, clear outside the city before he removes the plague. I believe that's the kind of faith we need to pattern after. Because that's what it's going to take to go through what's ahead of us in the last days. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:70. The prophet went forth, unheeding the fury of the tempest, and Pharaoh and all his host were witnesses to the power of Jehovah to preserve his messenger. Can you imagine them watching him walking out through the city, through that hail? How stubborn he was. He knew he couldn't do that. He couldn't walk out there. But there was Moses, the servant of God, walking through that storm unhurt. And so God was giving even Pharaoh a chance to turn around, and along with everybody else as well. Now here's one that Americans are going to really struggle with. Exodus 10, verse 7. The servants of Pharaoh said to him, knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Our cattle are killed, our crops are ruined, our fruit trees are destroyed. Things are destroyed. Let them go. Let the people go. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:71. The forests were broken down and the crops destroyed. They were fast losing all that had been gained by the labor of the Hebrews. The whole land was threatened with starvation. So I read one quote. I couldn't put everything I've studied in this sermon, but I read one quote that basically said, we will get to the point where we can only eat enough to stay alive. That's all. Just enough to stay alive. That's going to be a real test of faith for Americans, for people that live in this country and other first world countries. But God predicted it through the story of the deliverance of the Egyptians so that we could have some idea of what we were going to have to go through in order to make it to the heavenly Canaan. So when we say, I can't wait to get out of this world, we've got to also be saying, Lord, help me to have the faith that makes it possible for me to stay true with what I have to go through until I get there. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:72. The Hebrew slaves, so miraculously favored, were becoming confident of deliverance. So as time went on, it got better and better. And they started anticipating that they were going to get out. And that same thing is going to happen. It'll be worse in the beginning. Well, it'll get bad and keep getting worse, but then it'll start getting better, and we will be able to have more courage that, it really will happen. Their taskmasters dared not oppress them as heretofore. So that will no doubt happen to those that are in jail and in other places. Patriarchs and Prophets 272. Moses was regarded with awe by the Egyptians. The king dared not harm him, for the people looked upon him as alone possessing power to remove the plagues. So they would not stand for him to kill Moses, because the plague just might stay there. They desired that the Israelites might be permitted to leave Egypt. It was the king and the priests that opposed to the last the demands of Moses. Now, there's two lessons, I believe, two predictions in there. And that is that up until the close of probation, after that, nobody changed his sides. But before the close of probation, some people are going to say, let's leave these people alone. There's too much trouble when we fool with them. And the other lesson is that we are going to experience dictatorship. Again, that's going to be hard for Americans because we've had lots of freedom for the history of this country. But we can see a little bit already, can't we? That dictatorship is coming. And in Revelation it says that the nature of this country changes to the nature of a dragon. And so, thank you. This dictatorship is something that's going to be especially offensive to us. But as Christians, we have to endure it because it's part of the plan in order to get us fully ready and willing to cast aside the life of this world and get the life in heaven. So, I hope I haven't scared anybody today. My purpose is not to scare you, and I don't think we should have a sermon every Sabbath on this. But I am concerned about what Adventists think they're going to have to go through before Jesus comes. And I think that it's important for us to understand a little more accurately what we are going to have to go through so that when it hits us, we don't give up, I think many Adventists already surrendered during COVID to certain requirements that weren't good for us. And so that was a little bit of a test. But there's coming more of them. And we have to just know that whatever test we come up against, it's a chance to stand up for our faith. It's a chance to be faithful to what God asked us to do. And if we are, yes, there may be more wrath upon us, but some people are going to learn some things, including us. We're going to learn, and others are going to learn. And there will be people in heaven. You're aware that there was a huge number of Egyptians that went with the Israelites when they left. And so there's going to be a lot of other people join us as they watch us go through these struggles. They're going to say, you know what? They got the real thing. I want to join them. And so it'll be well worth it all. And we'll be better prepared as well.